Good morning on this fine, sunny November day here in London, where we're assembling for the great state ceremony of the opening of Parliament by Her Majesty the Queen, a ceremony which combines magnificent ritual, echoes of Britain's history, reminders of how democracy came to be established in this country and how, under our present constitution, it's upheld with the Queen at its head. Here in the House of Lords, people already gathering, and outside Westminster Hall, that great window there, the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster, with crowds gathered, with soldiers lining the route in the sunshine, statue of Richard I, and it's along here that the Queen will come in 10 or 15 minutes' time into the Victoria Tower and go to robe. But the first procession of the morning left about 20 minutes ago from Buckingham Palace, not the Queen. This is the procession of the regalia in the Queen Alexandra's state coach, accompanied in the jockey caps at the back by the barge master and the waterman, because once upon a time these precious crowns, cap of maintenance and mace used to go by river to Westminster. Now, of course, they go by coach and are just arriving at this moment at the foot of the steps. The Imperial State Crown, Sir John Johnson carrying it. And he takes it in to a small room at the foot of the steps where it's put on a different cushion to be brought up into the Royal Gallery, where it stays for the early part of the ceremonial here before the Queen arrives. It's taken in there, and the Queen's jeweller, who accompanies it everywhere, makes sure it's looking fine and dandy before it's carried up these steps, the royal staircase, which the Queen will come up to, lined by the Blues and Royals on the left, the Lifeguards on the right, into the Norman porch. Let's just have a look at the route of the ceremonial that we'll see this morning. First of all, the Queen will go in here to the robing room. Magnificent decoration, like all this part of the palace. This is where the House of Lords used to sit after the Houses of Parliament was bombed in 1941. The centrepiece, with its great circular embroidered cloth, is Victoria's chair of state, and above it the cloth of state, worked magnificently on red velvet by the Royal School of Needlework over 100 years ago, with the coat of arms embossed on it in fine silk. And then this ceiling, again in Henry VIII style, the whole of this palace decorated by Pugin, with Barry the architect, and the most wonderful workmanship. Everywhere you look, the kind of workmanship you very rarely see these days, and this is only just over 100 years ago. Beautifully gilded and restored in recent years, the whole palace being gradually done. Coats of arms round the side, and then symbolic pictures of hospitality and mercy and religion and generosity and courtesy, the various virtues, and then Arthurian legends as well around the walls. This is the fresco of religion. But everywhere you look, the fireplace, for instance, with the most elaborate and careful decoration on it. It's actually centrally heated now and very warm this morning, but this decoration with mosaics, with the lions, that's the fire back with the coat of arms and the crown over it, giving a very good idea of the way in which this part of the palace is decorated. These are the doors through which in the end the Queen will go when she's robed and has her crown on with the Tudor rose and the metalwork. And she'll come out into the Royal Gallery, where the people who've been lucky enough to get tickets are already assembled, waiting, where the yeomen of the guard are standing with their halberds, their white ruffs. They're the oldest, one of the oldest guards of the sovereign, 500 years old this year, set up by Henry VII in 1485. They last fought in the mid-18th century at the Battle of Dettingen, but they still are here on ceremonial occasions with steel-gilt halberds, ornamental swords, a magnificent sight. And this morning we're searching the vaults. And now the crown is on its new cushion, and a very important symbol on this occasion, the Imperial State Crown, with the sapphire in the top of it, which is said to be from Edward the Confessor's ring, with a ruby in it that was said to be worn at Agincourt by Henry V, and with part of the Cullinan diamond, one of the 4 stars of Africa, in it too, and a Stuart sapphire at the back. Very carefully carrying this crown, which is the crown the Queen wears on every state occasion except at her coronation. And it was redesigned for her when she came to the throne because it used to be rather taller, and they made it into what they thought was a more suitable shape for a woman. They lowered it a little bit and altered it. The Lord Great Chamberlain, the Marquis of Cholmondeley, whose family takes it in turns, with another family to be Lord Great Chamberlain, who's responsible for this part of the palace, puts it on a table there where it stands for 10 minutes or so in public view before he takes it into the robing room for the Queen, who of course will wear it during the procession up the Royal Gallery and into the House of Lords. And now the great sword of state, the second of the symbols, carried by Air Chief Marshal Sir John Barraclough, who's called the gentleman usher to the sword of state, and put with the cap of maintenance, that red cap with the ermine round that used to be worn under the crown, or worn now before the crown is put on the sovereign's head at the coronation. And those are the 3 symbols of the Queen's authority. Now the magnificent sight of the heralds of the College of Arms, incorporated in 1484 in their tabards with their wands, knee breeches and stockings, and they turn down out of the Royal Gallery and through into what is called the Norman Porch, and will be there to greet the Queen and escort her into the Royal Gallery when she arrives. Let's just have a look at the journey that the ceremonial will take today, because it is quite complicated and it's easy to get lost once it's begun. So let's have a look now. That's the whole of the Palace of Westminster, and on the left-hand side, the Victoria Tower, where the Queen will arrive and go up into the robing room, where she puts on the robe and the crown, and then she comes out into the Royal Gallery, which is another splendid room where heads of state come. Ronald Reagan was here when he spoke, for instance, to the joint Houses of Commons. And the carpet there, rather different from the old one, it's just been changed. The old one used to have watermarks on it. And she goes along the Royal Gallery and then out to the right there into the pale blue part, which is the House of Lords itself, and to the throne of the House of Lords. And when she's sat and she's asked the peers to be seated, she sends Black Rod off to the House of Commons to summon the Speaker. And so the small procession of Black Rod goes through the Peers' lobby. Now we're into the brown part there, along the Peers' corridor, into the public part, the central lobby there, which is where MPs meet their guests and people who want to come and get them to work for them. And then on into the Commons corridor, to the Commons lobby, and to the entrance door to the House of Commons. Winston Churchill on the left, Lloyd George on the right, those 2 statues. And the doors here slammed in the face of Black Rod. Before he's allowed to go in, he has to knock 3 times. And then the Speaker comes out from the House of Commons there, and with just the Queen's eye on him, the full length, because she can see him from one end of this palace to the other, he goes with the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the other politicians, back into the House of Lords. In the House of Lords, they'll arrive under this gallery where the clock is, at the bar of the House, that empty space with the carpeting, and that's where all the politicians from the House of Commons come, rather kept to one side on this occasion, though it's true to say that the Lords have to wait and the Queen has to wait for them to arrive. Above the clock there, the commentary box for radio and television, the House of Lords, has been televised throughout this session, and it may be that during the next session of Parliament, a decision's taken about televising the House of Commons, and that's the unobtrusive, Puginesque box that has been made. Now the arrival of the first members of the royal family who are not going to be in the Queen's procession, the Duke and Duchess of Kent. Duchess of Kent, who last night was at the Fashion Aid concert, and her husband was at a concert in the Festival Hall for Run by Business. He plays a prominent part in British industry. The Royal Standard now flying over the front of Buckingham Palace. The Royal Salute as the Queen's escort of the Household Cavalry leads the way out. And the Queen and Princess Anne on their way from that inner courtyard out to the front entrance of Buckingham Palace and out into the Mall to start their journey to the Palace of Westminster. The Queen is escorted by the 1st Division, the 2nd and the 3rd Division of the Sovereign's Escort, and travels, as always, the state opening on in the Irish State Coach, made in Dublin. Magnificent sight with a coachman in that full tricorn hat. The Duke of Edinburgh is away in Madagascar this year, which is why he's not here. Prince Charles and Princess Diana, of course, are in Australia, so it's the Queen and Princess Anne alone who travel, the Queen wearing that tiara which she'll exchange for the crown in a moment. Now that's the sight that brings thousands of people each year to London, the magnificent spectacle of the Queen with the escort in front, going up the wide stretch of the Mall towards Admiralty Arch. The plane trees on either side, still in leaf here in London, despite the recent frosts. Flags flying, the route that all the visitors to this country take when state ceremonial gives them a full state reception. The glass coach behind, with members of the royal household, and then 6 state landauls, so as many people as possible are travelling in horse-drawn coaches today, not by car. And they really take over the Mall as they go down there on their way to this throne in the House of Lords, which is where the Queen will sit to read the Queen's speech. Now, this is the speech, of course, that is prepared by the government and the Prime Minister. And the throne itself has been spectacularly restored in recent years, as has the whole Palace of Westminster. The Lord Great Chamberlain outside the House of Lords in the Royal Gallery takes the crown now into the robing room, where there's a screen set up and mirrors set up so that the Queen can just have 5 minutes or so rest and adjust the crown and put the state robe on before coming out again. It's carried in there. The gilding on this throne and the cloth of estate behind it has all been recently restored with tremendous care. This gilded work gets very worn and then is badly restored, and then nobody knows what the paint's like. And they've had the most meticulous work, but not just have they done it over a year or so, but they've done it without interfering with the House of Lords. So every day the scaffolding has to be put up and then taken down again when the Lords sit. The coat of arms behind. You can see the new gilding there shining particularly brilliantly. And then on each side of the throne, these angels who are holding, again, coats of arms, and they've been burnished really so much with gold that they look as if they're almost made of solid gold. The face in particular of that angel, and the hands, which are in fact wood just with gold leaf on them. Fujian's most elaborate and exuberant design, something that people thought was a bit over the top perhaps 50 years ago, but now I think we've all come to respect and admire the workmanship and the delicacy of the work. On the right, the chair of state on which Princess Anne will sit. The events that happen here this morning are important because it's the reason for Parliament being summoned here. The Queen has to give cause for summons, and even though they only ended their session last week, the reason for the speech is for the Queen to explain to the Parliament as a whole why it is that they've been brought together and why the Commons should come together and read out the legislation that's going to be produced. But what we see here is like the old medieval court. It's the symbols of the judiciary. The judges are there. The peers sitting in the middle there with the red cloaks with the white capes on the cross benches, some of whom arrived very early this morning. These peers in this back row were here at 9 o'clock this morning to get their seats. Were saying they always made a point of getting here. Lord Nugent on the right there, wearing the oldest robes, he says, in the House of Lords. 1760 those robes were made, when George III came to the throne. In front of those peers sit the wives of peers, sitting not in their own right, but as wives. And when, after Queen Victoria's death, there was an inquiry into how this should be handled and how this ceremonial should be done, it was decided to leave the peeresses there because they added so much to the beauty and gaiety of the occasion. Now, the key figure today is the Lord Chancellor. He's an important man. He's third only in the order of precedence of the country. He comes after the Queen and after the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Hailsham, a redoubtable figure, preceded by the doorkeeper, by his mace-bearer, Richard Stote, his principal private secretary, by Roy Beadle with the purse which carries the Queen's speech, and then the Lord Chancellor in full-bottomed wig and black and gold robes. And today he's here as the secretary, in effect, to the Queen. Horse Guards parade, and now gradually the ceremonial is coming together. The Queen coming through from Horse Guards parade on the far side, where Trooping the Colour takes place on her official birthday. Another sight well known to tourists here who come and pat the horses and have their photographs taken when the horses are standing in their sentry boxes on either side. The site of the old Palace of Whitehall. Quite a crush to get through the archway, and quite a delicate business manoeuvring the coach through there. Normally it's completely closed to traffic there. You have to have a special ivory pass to go through by car. Royal fanfare sounds from the far side of Horse Guards. They have bands and trumpeters placed at various points along this route to salute as the Queen goes by. Princess Anne on the left of the Queen, waving to the crowd as the coach turns down now into Whitehall, past the statue with its back to us, the equestrian statue of Lord Hague, and the cenotaph you can just see standing in the middle of the picture in the distance there, where the ceremonies of remembrance take place in a few days' time. And she goes down past government buildings, past the entrance to Downing Street, government offices, statues of Sir Walter Raleigh, Lord Montgomery, down to Parliament Square, and so to the Houses of Parliament itself. The royal family who are not taking part in the procession now come into the House of Lords, and everybody stands, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester and the Duke and Duchess of Kent. Duke of Gloucester there, who will sit in the front bench, and the two duchesses sit just behind them. And they sit alongside the government peers, a little space reserved for them at the end, the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent, and the Duchess of Kent and the Duchess of Gloucester sitting next to the wives of the ambassadors who are here. Lord Young of Graffham next to the Duke of Kent, the new Secretary of State for Employment. Lord Belstead, Deputy Leader in the House of Lords. Lord Cledwyn, Leader of the Labour peers. Lady Sear there, the Leader of the Liberal peers. Lord Diamond, Lady Hilton Foster, who is called the convener of the crossbench peers. Lord Aberdare, Chairman of Committees, and Lord Ponsonby, the Opposition Chief Whip. And they're one of the few groups of peers who actually have seats reserved for them. For most people, you have to get here early, and it's a bit of a bun fight. But the ambassadors' wives, who sit on the right here, they all have reserved places, but the peers in the rows behind have to get there early if they want to be able to see. The ambassadors were introduced here. The first was the Venetian ambassador in the 16th century. And at one point, the ambassadors were kept hidden behind a curtain and had to look at the proceedings through a hole in the curtain. But now they're traditionally here, and their wives, to listen to the Queen at the state opening. Botswana, Poland, Morocco, Indonesia, the Yemen, Turkish ambassador's wife, Zambian ambassador's wife, Paraguay, and the wife of the ambassador for Saudi Arabia, sitting next to the Duchess of Kent. The judges there on the two woolsacks on the left, the clerks of the House of Lords in black in the middle of the picture, holding back the peers, if you like, and then the judges who sit in those splendid black and gold robes on the two woolsacks that are put in place of the one on which the Lord Chancellor normally sits. National anthem playing as the Queen's coach arrives at the Palace of Westminster. Great cheer that's led by the boys of Westminster School, who have a special position on this side of the royal coach, just as they do at the coronation, and give a great cheer as she comes past. And the Queen's coach turns in under the Victoria Tower, which was the tower that led to the destruction of the old Houses of Parliament. It was here that the muniment room, where all the old rolls were stored, was being checked out, and they were setting fire to some old records they didn't need, and the whole thing caught fire, and that was how the palace was burnt down, and we had to have this new palace built. 1844 that happened. Queen in her palace, with the Lord Great Chamberlain escorting her and the heralds preceding her, now comes up the royal staircase, lined with the dismounted troop, lifeguards and blues and royals. The Lord Chamberlain on the left there, now carrying his purse. John Biffin, the leader of the House of Commons, on the right. And the new Black Rod on the right there, who we'll be seeing more of later when he's sent off to summon the House of Commons. And the Queen turns to the right here, through the Norman porch with its portraits and statues, mainly of former prime ministers. There's the red screen. You can just see which she goes behind to robe and to put the crown on. The heralds who led her up take their place and will stand here waiting now until the trumpets sound and the Queen with her crown comes out. The Lord Chancellor, Lord Hailsham, who's held this post 3 times, whose father's held the post of Lord Chancellor 3 times, who's a very important figure. He's in the cabinet, he's the head of the judiciary, he's the Speaker of the House of Lords, but today he is in effect the Queen's secretary. That used to be the job of the Lord Chancellor. He was a man who sat behind a screen when the sovereign was deciding policy and made notes and made sure it happened. And he was the man who prorogued Parliament just last Wednesday, reading the speech which led to Parliament coming to an end when, because of certain pressing causes and considerations, according to the words from the Queen, it was decided to prorogue, and he ordered them to come back and attend diligently on November the 6th, today. And just after he'd gone through that ceremony and read out the royal assent for various acts, I had a chance to talk to Lord Hailsham.
Could you tell me, first of all, why the Lord Chancellor plays such a prominent role in the state opening?
He's a very ancient office to begin with, and therefore he's embedded in the tradition of the thing. He is also the Speaker of the House of Lords as such. He tends, therefore, to be the intermediary, really, between the Crown and Parliament in this way, because he's the Speaker of the House of Lords and has to produce the Queen's speech.
But is he holding the speech as a member of the government or as the Queen's representative in Parliament?
The speech is, of course, composed by the government, but I suppose he's doing it as one of the great officers of state. That is to say, he's primarily, when the Queen is present, he's primarily the Queen's subject and not the Prime Minister's colleague.
Do you find it complex to go through the ceremonial?
Not now. I've done it on a number of occasions, and I've seen it done on more.
Enjoy it?
Well, yes, one's always a bit tense, you know. It's a strain when you're Lord Chancellor, because people have got their eyes on you and you're in front of the sovereign and so on.
Do you have a strong sense of the history of the occasion as you go through the rituals?
Yes, I think I do. It is, in fact, a very fine, colourful ceremony, reproducing something which has gone out of Europe completely, except here, and then only on that occasion. The sitting is not a sitting of the House of Lords. It is the Queen opening Parliament in the full glory of a medieval court, sitting in a royal palace.
What do you consider to be the most important function of the office of the Lord Chancellor?
Well, the basic thing is to maintain the independence, impartiality and integrity of the system of justice. For that purpose, you have various powers and functions and a few extra ones which have been accumulated over the years. But the really thing is to see that justice is impartial and that judges are of adequate quality.
And that's more important than your job in the House of Lords as Speaker?
The Speaker's job in the House of Lords is purely ornamental, really. If you'd gone into the parliaments of the 15th century, you would have found both the Commons and the Lords exercising their own authority. But because the Commons elect their Speaker, they gave him power. The Lords have never elected their Speaker because he's appointed by the sovereign. And the result is they gave him no power.
So when you're sitting on the woolsack, you really don't have very much to do?
Well, sometimes you get quite complex questions to put. And of course, what you get in return for that is that you're entitled to be as partisan as you like, though not from the woolsack. You have to take 2 paces smartly to the left, which puts you into the House, theoretically rising from a seat on what used to be called the Earl's Bench. And then you can make a partisan speech and vote.
This is the one occasion in the year when we see the Queen in Parliament. Do you see difficulties ahead for the Queen if we have a hung Parliament?
I frankly don't like the phrase, a hung Parliament. It's an American importation and means nothing in our context. In America, you have a hung jury because they've got to be unanimous. And the result is that if they're not unanimous, they can't give a verdict. Now, Parliament is never unanimous. It's not meant to be. It's always been divided in one way or another. The Queen's business is to find a government which will command a majority in the House of Commons, or, if she can't, to order a dissolution.
Is that going to be something that becomes more difficult, that the decisions are going to be harder if there's no overall majority?
Well, it's happened before. In the 19th century, it was rather often happening, and in the 18th century, still more so.
You're not prone, unlike some politicians, to give advice to Her Majesty on how she should carry out her duties?
I don't tell the Queen what to do. She's Queen. I'm only a subject.
Well, the Lord Chancellor with a reminder there that the Queen still does have an important political role to play, particularly if we have a Parliament after the next election with no overall majority. I spoke to him just after the proroguing at the middle of last week, and here he is today with the purse, with the speech you can just see in it, which he heard along with other cabinet ministers last night, and which he will give to the Queen. In Queen Victoria's reign, after the death of Prince Albert, it was the Lord Chancellor himself who used to read this speech. But ever since then, with an attempt to re-establish the ceremonial, to remind people of the relationship between the various parts of the Constitution, it's been read by the Sovereign. And now everyone is waiting for the Queen to come out of the robing room there and into the Royal Gallery. A moment of difficult ceremonial for her, I think, because in complete silence, under the eyes of all the people standing here, guests of people who work in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, private guests of the Queen and the Queen Mother, guests of the Lord Chamberlain, and others, the Queen has to walk down this great room. And in the meantime, the Speaker is on his way, as every day. Bernard Weatherall, who was appointed Speaker after this House of Commons began sitting. Bernard Weatherall, preceded by the doorkeeper, Reginald Tilley with the Sergeant-at-Arms, does what he does every day, which is to walk down to the House of Commons. Bernard Weatherall, who was a tailor to the Duke of Edinburgh, to Harold Macmillan. and a soldier. Very nervous about being made speaker, but he's made quite an impact there. He had a difficult act to follow in George Thomas, who made such a powerful reputation through radio. With his cannon behind him, he turns down into the House of Commons. The House of Commons will have their prayers, and then will come here into the House of Lords. Now that's the great ceiling that's been restored. It was beginning to collapse as well, and the whole of it has been rebuilt. Over £5 million so far spent on this gradual restoration of the Palace of Westminster. A really magnificent sight in its gold. Visitors in the gallery all the way round, some of them wives of politicians, other guests, people who haven't been able to get room on the floor of the house. And on those steps, the sons of peers, royal dukes, have a right to sit before they're in the House of Lords, but not today. Bishops there sitting in the front row, those who have a right to be here in the House of Lords, not all of them here. And one visiting bishop today, a guest of the Queen, the new Governor-General of New Zealand, Sir Paul Reeves, who's also Archbishop of New Zealand. He's had to give up being Archbishop in order to become Governor-General, but apparently can remain a bishop. Quite a unique combination. And the judges sitting on the low woolsacks there. The ambassadors, you can see one or two in Arab headdresses on the right, and they're chosen by seniority here at the Court of St. James, so that, for instance, rather curiously, Britain's great ally, the Ambassador of the United States, does not have a seat here today, whereas the Ambassador for Bulgaria and the Ambassador for Romania are right there in the front row, along with the Ambassador for the Soviet Union, sitting in spectacles there, sandwiched between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Behind, Ambassador from Morocco, and various other figures. And in the Royal Gallery, in the meantime, we're still waiting for the Queen. The heralds there in their tabards, who will turn when the Queen comes out and lead her into the House of Lords. Only two members of the procession, the Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Lewin, carrying the Sword of State, and the Viscount Whitelaw carrying the cap of maintenance, walk backwards all the way. The Lord Great Chamberlain, who supervises this ceremonial, and with him the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, on his right. And that's the sign that they're ready for the Queen to come out. And so, in absolute silence, the royal procession starts up the Royal Gallery. The Queen with her pages behind, 4 pages of honor, and Princess Anne behind her with the women of the bedchamber, the Mistress of the Robes, and Susan Hussey behind in the 3rd rank. And then following on the members of the royal household. And walking backwards there, the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk. Behind the Mistress of the Robes, the Duchess of Grafton, in the centre there, come Lords in Waiting, the Rear Admiral of the United Kingdom, the Captain of the Yeomen of the Guard, the Captain of the Honourable Corps of Gentlemen-at-Arms, the Controllers of the Royal Household, ending up with the Lieutenant of the Honourable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms, Lieutenant of the Yeomen of the Guard. And backwards into the House of Lords, the Earl Marshal and the Lord Great Chamberlain, followed by the Sword of State and the Cap of Maintenance, and everyone stands as the Queen comes in. The train has to be very carefully arranged on the steps there. It's a long, heavy train. It makes walking difficult, but it's particularly important it should be put comfortably by those pages who rehearsed it, of course, carefully yesterday.
My lords, pray be seated.
Takes her seat. So she's nodded to Lord Great Chamberlain, who waves his wand and dispatches Black Rod on his journey to the House of Commons. The procession, a very small one, Commander Kemp in the front, Mr. Huxley, the principal doorkeeper of the House of Lords,
all strangers!
and Black Rod behind. Black Rod, Air Chief Marshal Sir John Gingell, who's just taken over from Sir David House, who's a flying man, was Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces in Europe, first flew in a Tiger Moth in 1943 and still likes doing that. And he has one of the oldest offices of all, Black Rod. It's over 600 years old. He used to be what was called a doorkeeper to the Knights of the Garter, founded by Edward III after the Battle of Crécy in 1348. Carries this rod instead of a mace made of black ebony as his symbol of authority, and is sent by the sovereign as her messenger to the House of Commons, back into the Commons lobby, where the door is now shut in his face, and he has to knock 3 times and ask entry.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honorable House to attend upon Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
The traditional summons, and the Speaker, Bernard Weatherall, comes in front of the government bench on the left there. You'll recognize many of the faces of cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister with a blue scarf and a hat, but it's the Speaker who leads the way out with the Commons mace in front of him, again the symbol of authority in the House of Commons. And then front benches, Mrs. Thatcher on the left, Neil Kinnock, Sir Geoffrey Howe, Roy Hattersley, Leon Britton, Dennis Healey, Peter Shaw, the 2 leaders of the Alliance, David Steele and David Owen, other cabinet ministers, new Home Secretary David Hurd there. And as you get back along this line, they become more and more junior until in the end it becomes a sort of bun fight to get into the row. Edward Heath there, former Prime Minister, and they all leave this very small room. One MP who's obviously decided to stay put. One MP said that this was a good moment for your constituents to see you on television, so they quite like to get into the bun fight here on their way up to the House of Lords. And they're going to hear, many of them for the first time, what it is that the government is going to propose. Kenneth Clarke in the centre there, Robin Cook on the right with the red beard, Neil Kinnock's close associate, who's in charge of policy for the next general election. Gwyneth Dunwoody on the right, just thrown out of the shadow cabinet. Miss Crush as they wait to get through, but at the front in a far more orderly fashion. The procession is coming back through the Peers lobby, through the Peers corridor, into the Peers lobby, and will come to the bar of the House of Lords. Gerald Kaufman, Norman Tebbit there, Douglas Hurd, Keith Joseph walking with James Callaghan, Kenneth Baker on the left, newly promoted, Tom King, John Wakeham on the left, the Chief Whip in the House of Lords. Then the scattering of Liberals and Alliance politicians among this group. They won't all be able to get in. Michael Mates. And they gossip as they go along. It's quite a rare occasion for them in front of this great crowd. And the House of Commons, in the meantime, almost deserted. They'll be back here this afternoon to discuss the Queen's speech, but for the moment, they're all on their way out. The Commons with its green benches that make it stand out from the House of Lords with its scarlet leather. Both of them rather smaller chambers. Everybody who goes into them always says how much smaller they seem than they had imagined. And so, as they arrive, the procession bows to the throne and to the Queen, and we wait while the rest of them come in for the Queen to start her speech. The Queen, who's watched this procession from the throne, she can see right down to the far end and has seen them coming towards her, and she's waiting until as many of them are as in place and quiet and attentive for her to read the speech, which will set out the policies the government intend to pursue, the legislation they're proposing to put forward over the next 12 months. Once everybody's in place, the Lord Chancellor will walk up the steps and hand the speech to the Queen from the purse. Trevor Beeson there, the canon to the House of Commons, standing on the left of Neil Kinnock. So everyone is in place, and the Duke of Norfolk just bows to the Lord Chancellor, telling him that the time has come for his part of the ceremony.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I look forward with great pleasure to receiving His Highness the Emir of Qatar, Their Majesties the King and Queen of Spain, and the President of the Federal Republic of Germany, and Frau von Weizsäcker on state visits during the next 12 months. I also look forward to paying a state visit to Nepal in February, followed by visits to New Zealand and Australia, and to paying a state visit to China and visiting Hong Kong in October. My government continues to attach the highest importance to the maintenance of national security and the preservation of peace with freedom and justice. They will continue to play a full and active part in the Atlantic Alliance and to enhance the United Kingdom's own defences. They will make vigorous efforts to combat international terrorism. My government will continue to work for progress in arms control and disarmament negotiations, and for greater cooperation and trust between East and West. My government welcomed the accession of Spain and Portugal to the European Community and will introduce the necessary legislation. Within the community, they will work for improved decision-taking, strengthened cooperation on foreign policy, early completion of the common market, improvements in world trade rules, and reform of the common agricultural policy. While honouring their undertakings to the people of the Falkland Islands, my government will continue to seek more normal relations with Argentina. They will also continue to discharge their obligations to the people of Hong Kong and will propose provisions to implement the nationality arrangements arising from the Sino-British Joint Declaration. My government will work for peaceful and fundamental change in South Africa with the European Community and the Commonwealth, for the restoration of peace and stability in Lebanon, and for solutions to the conflict between Iraq and Iran and the Arab-Israel dispute. They will seek to restore an independent and non-aligned Afghanistan. They will support United Nations efforts for a settlement in Cyprus and those of the Contadora Group to resolve the tensions in Central America. My government will give full support to the Commonwealth and play a constructive role at the United Nations. They will maintain a substantial aid program, play their part in the relief of famine and of other disasters, and encourage investment in developing countries. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public service will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, within the framework of firm monetary and fiscal policies designed to secure a continuing reduction in inflation, my government will do all in their power to encourage the growth of new jobs. Firm control of public expenditure will be maintained, with a view to diminishing its share of overall national output and facilitating further reductions in the burden of income tax. My government will pursue vigorously their programme of privatisation as a means both of improving the efficiency of the industries concerned and of encouraging wider share ownership. Measures will be introduced to permit the transfer of the assets of the British Gas Corporation to the private sector and to enable the Atomic Energy Authority to operate as a trading fund from the 1st of April 1986 with a capital structure and borrowing powers. A bill will be proposed to introduce private capital into the British Airports Authority, to require larger local authority airports to be formed into companies, and to regulate certain airport activities. My government will bring forward legislation to introduce commercial management to my naval dockyards as a significant contribution to encouraging a commercial approach and securing value for money in spending on defence. Legislation will be introduced to facilitate funding by the industry of agricultural research, advice and related services, and to implement European Community arrangements to protect areas of particular environmental sensitivity. Measures will be introduced to establish a new regulatory framework for the financial services sector, which will enhance its efficiency and competitiveness, while providing greater safeguards for the interests of investors, and to modernize and liberalize the law governing building societies. Measures will be brought forward to reform the operation of wages councils, to make provisions concerning the payments of wages, and to amend the law on sex discrimination in employment. Legislation will be introduced to encourage the sale of public sector flats to their tenants and wider private sector involvement in the ownership and management of council housing, and to improve the planning system. For Scotland, bills will be introduced to extend the rights of public sector tenants and to facilitate the private ownership of public sector housing stock, to improve legal aid arrangements, and to modify and extend the management structure of salmon fisheries, including further measures to combat illegal salmon fishing throughout Great Britain. In Northern Ireland, my government will continue to support the security forces in enforcing the law and in working for the eradication of terrorism. They will seek widely acceptable arrangements for the devolution of power. They will seek to improve further their cooperation with the government of the Irish Republic. Renewed efforts will be made to create and sustain employment, particularly by the encouragement of the private sector. A bill will be introduced to reform social security. Legislation will be introduced for England and Wales to improve the management of schools and to promote the professional effectiveness of teachers. Measures will be introduced to strengthen the powers of the police in combating disorder, to modernise and codify the common law public order offences in England and Wales, and to provide the courts in England and Wales with power to confiscate the proceeds of drug trafficking and to penalise the handling of such proceeds. A bill will be introduced to remove statutory restrictions on shop opening hours. A bill will be brought before you to make new provision for the protection of animals used for experimental or other scientific purposes. Other measures will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
The Lord Chancellor now comes to take back the speech. Which gave the causes of the summons of the House of Parliament. And everybody waits now as the pages go and lift the train, which has little handles on it for them to hold, and the whole house rises. And in that stilted and formal language of the Queen's speech prepared by the government, by the Prime Minister, with its mixture of measures, some of them detailed, tiny proposals, some of them to do with attitudes the government will take. But in that, the whole function of this ceremony is really explained, which is the Queen explaining to the Commons the diverse, difficult and pressing affairs which has led Parliament to be reassembled. That's the language that's been used down the centuries and still is the explanation for today's ceremonial of the state opening. the Queen summoning the members of Parliament and explaining why they should now sit for another session. And back here in the Royal Gallery, the procession with the heralds, with the Lord Chancellor, and still walking backwards, the Earl Marshal and the Lord Great Chamberlain. The Queen comes back. The ordeal of reading that speech over, back into the Sovereign's robing room. And this time not looking dead ahead, but just looking a little from side to side, slightly less formal than on the approach to the House of Lords. The pages are the sons of members of the royal household or other people with official functions: Piers Blewett, Malcolm MacLean, Robert Cecil, Harry Legge Burke. Two of them doing it for the first time, two of them have been pages before. And then Princess Anne, a very glamorous puff-sleeved dress. The yeoman on each side, and the Queen goes back under this great arch with its two huge statues and the two rather less attractive television sets that allow people there to watch this whole ceremony, because they can't see it once the Queen has gone through into the House of Lords. And the royal household following, and then the gentlemen-at-arms in the white plumes, who we never see, who are a senior body to the yeomen of the guard, but who are out of sight in the entrance to the House of Lords, the Prince's chamber. And as the Queen comes in, they lower that standard onto the ground in front of her. And so the ceremony is over and everybody gets up and starts away. The House of Commons members have already gone from the bar of the House and are on their way back, having heard what's been proposed. There's been a lot of discussion about what was going to be in this speech. There are those in the Conservative Party who didn't want too many new measures put forward, the so-called consolidators. There were others who say that with an election coming up in a couple of years, it was important to keep radical measures going. Well, we shall hear this afternoon what the House of Commons as a whole thinks of what's been proposed. There was a commitment to further reduce income tax. There was a commitment to denationalise British Gas and the Atomic Energy Authority, the British Airports Authority, naval dockyards to be put into commercial management, new legislation about financial services, attempts to improve relations with the Irish Republic, Norman Fowler's bill on social security, that's to go ahead. There was some question about whether or how far they'd get with that. A bill to promote the professional effectiveness of teachers, which Sir Keith Joseph will be putting through the House, and bills as promised on drugs and on public order, and on removing statutory restrictions on shop opening hours, in other words, opening shops on Sundays, which had also been promised, and the final measure for the protection of animals used for experimental and scientific purposes. In the House of Lords, there's a black peer there, Lord Pitt, right in the middle. You can just see in ermine and red, and they're all going off. Most of these peers who come here today, and indeed everybody who takes part in this ceremony, loves coming because they enjoy the spectacular ceremonial and they make a party of it. A lot of them have guests or friends who come up to London for the day, and they go off to lunch parties after it and treat it as a occasion for a bit of jollity, and all enjoy the ceremony, and all of all parties think it important that it should be carried out in the way that it has been this morning, as it has for many years. And so as the peers start to leave the House of Lords, it's time for us too to say goodbye from Westminster after another state opening, a speech which lays out the government's policy for the coming year, which will be debated this afternoon in the House of Commons. The judge is there, leaving the judge's woolsack in their robes and their long wigs, and setting off to the left of the throne. And the end of another day of complex ceremonial, full of symbols, full of reminders of how things used to be in this country and how they came to be the way they are today and why they've changed. And an occasion for a country like ours, which doesn't have a written constitution, for a reminder of how the constitution in practice works, with the Queen at its head. A reminder that though politicians come and go, the constitution they work within endures.